Step into the hushed silence of a medieval cathedral, where flickering candlelight casts eerie shadows across stone walls adorned with grotesque carvings, twisted faces, monstrous creatures, and figures writhing in agony. These unsettling images weren't just the whims of imaginative artists. They were a deliberate language, a visual code that spoke to the deepest fears of an entire era. For medieval people, the world was a place of constant peril, plague, war, and the ever-present specter of divine judgment loomed large, and in their art, they poured those terrors into symbols so potent, they still send shivers down our spines centuries later. What's fascinating is how these dark motifs served a dual purpose. On one hand, they were warnings, vivid reminders of the consequences of sin, meant to steer the faithful toward piety. A grinning demon perched above a church door wasn't just decoration. It was a threat, a reminder that hell's jaws waited for the unwary. But these images also offered something unexpected, a strange comfort. By giving form to their fears, sculpting them into stone, painting them onto altarpieces, medieval people could confront the unknown, making it tangible, even manageable. The monstrous and the macabre became tools for understanding a world filled with chaos and uncertainty. By the time we're done, you'll never look at medieval art the same way again. Those grimacing gargoyles and haunting frescoes, they're more than just relics of a superstitious past. They're windows into the collective psyche of an age where art wasn't just about beauty. It was about survival, morality, and the desperate human need to make sense of the darkness. So let's unravel the secrets hidden in these ancient masterpieces and discover how the nightmares of the Middle Ages still echo in our own modern fears. Religion was the lens through which medieval people understood every aspect of their world, from the changing seasons to sudden disasters. The church didn't just dictate morality, it shaped reality itself, teaching that every misfortune, from crop failures to the Black Death, was a sign of divine displeasure. And nowhere was this message more brutally clear than in the art that filled their sacred spaces. Walk into any medieval church, and you'd be confronted with frescoes of the damned writhing in eternal flames, their bodies gnawed by demons with needle-sharp teeth. These weren't just stories, they were psychological weapons, designed to grip the faithful with a visceral dread of straying from the path of righteousness. Take the famous tympanum at the Cathedral of St. Lazare in Autun, where a gaunt figure of Christ presides over the weighing of souls. On one side, angels lift the saved toward heaven. On the other, grotesque devils drag sinners into the gaping maw of hell, their faces twisted in despair. What's chilling is how personal these scenes felt. The artists often included details from daily life: a cheating merchant with his scales still in hand, a gossiping woman with a serpent coiled around her tongue. These weren't abstract warnings, they were mirrors forcing viewers to ask, could that be me? But the church's use of fear went deeper than simple intimidation. These images also offered a perverse kind of hope. By illustrating the horrors of hell in such explicit detail, they made salvation feel tangible, something you could almost reach out and grasp if you just followed the rules. It's no accident that many of these terrifying scenes were placed near baptismal fonts or along the path to the altar. They were part of a carefully crafted journey, guiding the faithful from terror to redemption. The message was clear. Yes, the world was full of darkness, but the church held the only light that could keep it at bay. What's remarkable is how these medieval artists weaponized the unknown. They took the universal human fear of pain, abandonment, and chaos, things everyone in that era understood intimately, and gave them a face. A demon wasn't just a monster, It was the embodiment of famine, disease, or war. The mouth of hell, often depicted as a literal monstrous head swallowing sinners whole, mirrored the very real terror of being consumed by forces beyond one's control. In a world without science to explain disasters, these images became a way to rationalize suffering. If hell was real, then at least there was a reason for the agony of earthly life. And if you obeyed, you might just escape it. Nothing captured the medieval obsession with mortality more vividly than the Dance of Death. Picture a procession where grinning skeletons, their hollow eyes gleaming with mischief, clasp hands with kings, bishops, and peasants alike, dragging them all toward the same inevitable fate. This macabre motif didn't just decorate church walls. It was a cultural reckoning, a stark equalizer in a world rigidly divided by class and privilege. When the Black Death swept through Europe, wiping out entire villages in weeks, it shattered the illusion that wealth or status could shield anyone from the grave. And artists responded with a chilling truth: death was the ultimate democrat. The frescoes in Basel's old cathedral are among the most haunting examples. Here, skeletal figures twirl with their living partners in a ghastly parade, a pope in his regalia, a nobleman clutching his purse, a young bride in her wedding gown. Each scene is a masterclass in psychological terror, stripping away the pretenses of power and piety. Notice how the skeletons mock their partners, mimicking their earthly gestures with eerie precision. The merchant still counting coins, death playfully dangles a purse just out of reach. The knight brandishing his sword, a skeleton disarms him with a bony chuckle. These weren't just morbid jokes, they were subversive acts undermining the hierarchies that medieval society held sacred. Paris's Cemetery of the Holy Innocents took the theme even further, turning its cloister walls into a sprawling canvas of mortality. Pilgrims walking its arcades would see death as a relentless force, plucking children from their mothers' arms, toppling emperors from their thrones, and snuffing out lovers mid-embrace. What's striking is how these scenes mirrored the chaos outside the church walls. In an era where life could vanish between sunrise and sunset, the Dance of Death offered a bizarre comfort. If everyone, rich or poor, saint or sinner, shared the same end, then perhaps fear could be faced together. But beneath the grim theatrics lay a deeper purpose. By personifying death as an active, almost playful figure, artists made the abstract tangible. A skeleton wasn't just a symbol, it was a character, one that could be confronted, even bargained with. In doing so, they transformed paralyzing dread into something strangely familiar, a dance partner who, however unwelcome, couldn't be ignored. This visual storytelling became a survival tactic, a way to process grief in a world where loss was constant. The genius of the Dance of Death was its duality. It horrified and humored, terrified and consoled. For modern viewers, these frescoes might seem like relics of a bygone superstition. But look closer, and you'll recognize the same existential questions we grapple with today: how to live when time is fleeting, how to find meaning in the face of the unknown. The skeletons on those medieval walls still whisper a timeless warning. Life's grandest titles and treasures are just costumes. In the end, the dance awaits us all. If the gargoyles leering from cathedral eaves could speak, they'd whisper tales of temptation twisted, half-animal figures frozen mid-snarl, their bat wings spread as if ready to swoop down and snatch the unwary. Medieval artists didn't just imagine demons, they weaponized them, crafting grotesque hybrids that distilled every nightmare into tangible form. A demon might have the talons of a bird, the tail of a serpent, and the face of a starved wolf, each feature chosen to evoke visceral revulsion. These weren't random monsters, they were psychological traps designed to trigger an instinctive recoil, as if the very sight of them could sear the soul. Consider the illuminated manuscripts where demons swarm the margins, their bodies contorted into impossible shapes. In the tres riches huras do duc de bury, a blue-skinned fiend with too many eyes stuffs a damned soul into its maw like a glutton swallowing grapes. What's striking is how often these creatures mimic human vices. A demon might wear a jester's cap to mock pride, or its belly might bulge with gluttony, a living caricature of sin. This wasn't just artistry, it was propaganda. By making sin ugly, the church made virtue beautiful by contrast. Yet the most unsettling demons weren't the ones roaring in hellfire, they were the tricksters. In the Hortus Deliciarum, a 12th century encyclopedia, the devil appears as a handsome nobleman, his true nature revealed only by the clawed feet hidden beneath his robes. This duality tapped into a profound medieval anxiety. Evil wasn't always monstrous. It could be charming, persuasive, lurking in the guise of a neighbor or even a priest. Artists drove this home by placing demons in familiar settings, whispering in a merchant's ear during a dishonest sale, or lounging in taverns where drunkards squandered their wages. The evolution of demonic imagery reveals a fascinating tension. Early medieval depictions leaned on animal hybrids, wolf heads, goat legs, symbolizing humanity's base instincts. But as theology grew more sophisticated, so did the monsters. By the late Middle Ages, demons became master manipulators, their forms reflecting specific sins. A lust demon might be part toad, its sticky skin oozing filth. A greed demon could have coin-filled pouches for eyes. This precision turned abstract vices into avoidable threats. If you recognize the demon's form, you might just escape its grasp. What's often overlooked is how these images served as coping mechanisms. In a world where illness, famine, and violence felt like supernatural assaults, blaming a horned fiend offered a perverse relief. If the devil caused your suffering, at least there was someone to blame and someone to defeat through prayer. The gargoyle snarling from the rooftop wasn't just a warning, it was a ward, its ugliness a shield against the evil it represented. Medieval people didn't just fear demons, they outsmarted them, carving their nightmares into stone where they could be watched, named, and ultimately controlled. Today, we might dismiss these creatures as relics of superstition, but their legacy lingers in the stories we tell: the seductive vampire, the charming serial killer. The medieval devil's greatest trick wasn't hiding his horns, it was teaching us that monsters wear many faces, and the most dangerous ones still walk among us. Hell wasn't just a place in the medieval imagination, it was an immersive theater of agony, where every sin had its own gruesomely inventive punishment. Step into the world of a 15th century altarpiece, and you'd find liars suspended by their tongues over flaming pits, gluttons force-fed molten gold, and lazy souls stretched on racks for eternity. These weren't random torments, they were divine justice rendered in horrifying detail, a visual curriculum of consequences designed to sear itself into the viewer's memory. Take Hieronymus Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights, where the right panel unfolds like a nightmare encyclopedia. A gambler is pinned to his own dice table, blades slicing his hands with every roll. A miser, still clutching his coin purse, is defecated on by bird-like demons, a crude but effective metaphor for the futility of hoarding wealth. What's chilling is how these punishments mirrored medieval society's deepest anxieties. The lustful weren't just burned, they were frozen in blocks of ice, their desires literally petrified. The prideful, who once strutted in fine silks, were forced to crawl naked through mud, their bodies scratched by thorns. These scenes didn't just shock, they taught, reinforcing hierarchies and norms. A peasant viewing a fresco of a rebellious serf being dismembered by demons would think twice before challenging their lord. The church understood something profound. Fear sticks when it's specific, but Bosch's genius lay in his subversion. Beneath the moralizing, his hellscapes teem with dark humor and surrealism. One figure is crucified on a harp, their musical sins turned against them. Another is roasted on a spit by demons who snack on their flesh like festival food. This absurdity made the horror unforgettable, blurring the line between sermon and spectacle. It's no accident that his work was displayed in noble courts, where the wealthy could gawk at the fate awaiting greed and excess, even as they indulged in both. The precision of these punishments reveals another layer. They were relatable. A farmer might not grasp theological abstractions, but they understood the agony of a scythe's cut or the stench of boiling excrement. By grounding hell in visceral, everyday suffering, artists made damnation feel immediate. A 14th century manuscript from Florence shows a baker shoved headfirst into his own oven, a direct warning to those who might cheat customers with underweight loaves. These weren't generic torments, they were divine retribution tailored to the viewer's world. Yet for all their brutality, these images offered a twisted kind of reassurance. If every sin had its matching punishment, then the universe wasn't chaotic, it was meticulously fair. The adulterer swallowed by a giant toad, the gossip gnawed by serpents. Each fate confirmed a moral order, however grim. In a time of plague and upheaval, that certainty was its own comfort. Even hell had rules. Today, we might dismiss these scenes as over-the-top propaganda. But their legacy lingers in our own culture of public shaming and viral outrage. The medieval hellscape was more than art. It was a mirror, reflecting the timeless human urge to see vice punished and to believe deep down that we're among the saved. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, it didn't just decimate the population, it rewrote the visual language of an entire era. Imagine a world where half your neighbors, your family, even the priest who delivered last rites, could be dead within days. The plague left survivors drowning in grief and guilt, haunted by questions with no answers. Why did I live when others perished? Is this God's wrath? And in that suffocating climate of fear, art became a mirror for collective trauma. Gone were the serene saints and golden halos of earlier centuries. In their place emerged a stark new aesthetic skeletal figures looming over feast tables, corpses mid-decay in their tombs, and the grim Reaper himself, scythe in hand, stepping indifferently over piles of the dead. The Danse Macabre frescoes that spread like wildfire after the plague weren't just morbid decoration. They were a coping mechanism. In the Church of St. Mary in Lübeck, a mural showed death as a grinning puppeteer, pulling strings attached to emperors, knights, and beggars alike. The message was brutal in its simplicity. Your title won't save you, your wealth won't protect you. These artworks functioned as medieval group therapy, validating the terror people felt while offering a strange solace in shared fate. If everyone, king and peasant, was equally powerless, then perhaps survivors weren't being punished personally. The plague was random, but art made that randomness feel like part of a larger, if grim, order. Perhaps the most haunting shift was in depictions of the human body. Pre-plague art showed death as a peaceful transition, saints resting with folded hands, their faces serene. Post-plague, trancy tombs featured sculptures of the deceased as rotting corpses, worms threading through hollow eye sockets, flesh peeling from bone. The one in Westminster Abbey for John of Eltham shows his body bloated, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. These weren't just warnings about vanity, they were stark confrontations with the physical reality survivors had witnessed firsthand. After seeing streets piled with blackened bodies, idealized death felt like a lie. The art had to match the horror they'd lived. Even religious scenes took on a darker tone. The once triumphant resurrection now emphasized Christ's wounds gaping, graphic, almost festering. A 15th century German altarpiece shows him rising not in glory, but with blood still dripping from his palms, his skin clinging to his ribs like a famine victim's. This wasn't just piety, it was identification. A population that had watched loved ones waste away needed a savior who understood suffering intimately. What's fascinating is how these motifs bled into everyday objects. Hourglasses appeared on jewelry, their sand trickling relentlessly. Skulls were carved into the handles of cutlery, a memento mori with every meal. Even playing cards from the era feature skeletons as the suits. The plague didn't just inspire grand artwork, it seeped into the domestic, the mundane, because survival meant living with death as a constant companion. This artistic shift reveals something profound about trauma's role in creativity. When words failed to capture the scale of loss, images stepped in. The Grim Reaper wasn't just a symbol, he was a shorthand for survivors' unspeakable experiences. And in giving form to those horrors, medieval artists did something remarkable. They made the unbearable slightly more manageable. The skeletons on those frescoes weren't just threats. They were acknowledgments. Yes, this happened. Yes, we remember. In a world stripped of certainty, art became the one thing that didn't look away. At the edge of a medieval village where the forest shadows grew long and the wind whispered through the trees, artists painted the ultimate outcast, the witch. Her face was often a grotesque mask of wrinkles, her body bent like a gnarled root, her hands clutching strange herbs or the leash of a demonic familiar. These weren't just flights of artistic fancy. They were propaganda, transforming folk healers and midwives into monstrous scapegoats for society's ills. In a world where unexplained illness or a failed harvest could spark panic, the witch became a convenient villain, her image weaponized to justify brutal purges. Look closely at Hans Baldung Green's 16th century woodcuts, where naked witches ride goats backward through storm clouds, their hair whipping like flames. Surrounding them are the tools of their supposed trade cauldrons bubbling with cursed potions, stolen communion wafers used in black magic, and animal-headed demons whispering in their ears. What's chilling is how these details mirrored real accusations during witch trials. A woman might be condemned because her neighbor claimed she milked an invisible witch's teat to feed her familiar, or because she'd been seen gathering herbs under a full moon. Art didn't just reflect these fears, it amplified them, turning local gossip into visual nightmares that seeped into the public imagination. The heretic, too, was a favorite target of medieval artists, often depicted in church frescoes as a snarling figure tearing pages from scripture or setting fire to a crucifix. In the Alba Bible, a 15th century Spanish manuscript, heretics are shown with distorted faces, their tongues split like serpents to symbolize their forked deceit. These images served a dual purpose. They rallied the faithful against a common enemy while reinforcing the church's absolute authority. If dissenters were painted as subhuman, their bodies twisted, their eyes glowing with demonic light, then their persecution could be framed as holy duty rather than cruelty. But the most revealing detail lies in what these figures lack. Witches and heretics are almost never shown in domestic settings, never painted as mothers, neighbors, or farmers. They exist outside the boundaries of community, often framed by wilderness or hellfire. This visual isolation tapped into a primal medieval anxiety, the fear of the other. In an era where belonging to the church meant survival, being cast out was a fate worse than death. Artists made sure viewers understood stray from the flock, and you'd be rendered as monstrous as those on the margins. Yet hidden in these grotesque portrayals is a paradox. The very women accused of witchcraft often possessed knowledge that threatened the church's monopoly on power, herbal medicine, midwifery, even literacy. By demonizing them, authorities didn't just suppress individuals, they suppressed alternative worldviews. A witch's cauldron wasn't just a prop, it symbolized the danger of female autonomy, of wisdom that didn't come from priests. The Heretics' burning book wasn't just blasphemy, it was a threat to controlled narratives. What's tragic is how these images outlived their era, seeping into folklore and shaping prejudices that lingered for centuries. The hook-nosed, broom-riding crone still haunts our Halloween decorations, a relic of medieval fear-mongering. But peel back the layers, and you'll find something far more human beneath, not monsters, but the vulnerable, the unconventional, the inconvenient. Their real crime wasn't consorting with demons, it was daring to exist outside the lines. The four horsemen thunder across the pages of medieval manuscripts, their hooves cracking the earth as they herald the end of all things. Few images captured the medieval psyche like these apocalyptic riders, each a personification of humanity's deepest dread. The pale horse of death gallops ahead, skeletal fingers clutching a scythe. Behind him, famine swings empty scales, his hollow ribs pressing against parchment-thin skin. War brandishes a sword dripping with gore, while conquest, sometimes called pestilence, rides a white stallion, his crown gleaming cruelly above the chaos. These weren't just illustrations, they were fever dreams given form, born from an era where crop failures, wars, and plagues made the end times feel not just possible, but inevitable. Turn to the 15th century Bamberg apocalypse, and you'll find the Antichrist depicted as a grotesque parody of Christ, his halo blackened, his miracles revealed as cheap tricks performed by lurking demons. What's striking is how artists wove contemporary anxieties into these biblical prophecies. The Antichrist doesn't just deceive, he holds court like a corrupt pope, surrounded by scheming cardinals counting blood money. Here, the apocalypse isn't a distant myth. It's a warning about the rot within the church itself, a reflection of growing disillusionment during the turbulence of the late Middle Ages. Then there's the ultimate showdown, the Battle of Armageddon, splashed across altarpieces in gory detail. In the bone Last Judgment, angels and demons clash in midair, their weapons glinting as souls tumble between them like hailstones. The damned aren't faceless masses, they're armored knights, fur-clad merchants, even monks still clutching their rosaries. This specificity was deliberate. By populating Doomsday with familiar figures, artists forced viewers to ask, which side would I be on? But perhaps the most haunting detail lies in the margins of these scenes. Look closely, and you'll spot ordinary people reacting to the apocalypse around them. A mother shielding her child from falling stars. A farmer abandoning his plow as the sky splits open. These tiny vignettes reveal something profound. Medieval artists understood that the true terror of the end times wasn't just divine wrath, but the shattering of the everyday. The world wouldn't end with a bang, but with bread left unbaked in ovens, with half-woven cloth unraveling on looms. What's fascinating is how these apocalyptic artworks functioned as both warning and comfort. Yes, they depicted unimaginable horrors, but by giving shape to those fears, they also made them finite, survivable. The Antichrist could be unmasked. The horsemen would eventually pass. Even the most gruesome Last Judgment frescoes always ended with one radiant detail: the saved, bathed in golden light, stepping into a new Jerusalem. For people living through famine and plague, that glimpse of hope was as vital as the terror that preceded it. Today, we might dismiss these visions as relics of superstition. But scroll through any newsfeed, and you'll see the same existential dread dressed in modern garb: climate disaster warnings, pandemic models, nuclear countdowns. The medieval apocalypse reminds us that humanity has always wrestled with the fear of annihilation. The horsemen never really left, they just traded their steeds for new metaphors. And perhaps that's the most unsettling revelation of all: the end times aren't a medieval fantasy. They're a mirror reflecting whatever nightmares haunt the present. Beneath the surface of medieval art's religious terror lurked another layer of fear, one whispered in symbols only a select few could decipher. Take the Ouroboros, that cryptic serpent devouring its own tail. To the uninitiated, it might seem like just another odd decoration, but to alchemists and occult scholars, it was a pulsating heart of mystery, representing the eternal cycle of creation and destruction. This wasn't mere decoration, it was a visual cipher, a way to encode dangerous knowledge in plain sight. In an era where the wrong belief could get you branded a heretic, these symbols became a survival tactic, a way to share secrets without speaking them aloud. Consider the enigmatic illustrations in the Ripley Scroll, a 15th century alchemical manuscript. At first glance, it's a riot of fantastical imagery: kings dissolving in baths of mercury, dragons battling in celestial courts, and hermaphroditic figures symbolizing the union of opposites. But every flourish held meaning. The dragon wasn't just a monster, it represented primal matter, the chaotic base from which alchemists believed all metals could be purified. Even the colors were coded: crimson for the volatile, azure for the fixed, gold for the ultimate goal transmutation. These weren't whimsical doodles. They were equations in disguise, a visual language for those who knew how to read it. What's fascinating is how these esoteric symbols mirrored society's broader anxieties. The philosopher's stone, that legendary substance said to turn lead into gold, wasn't just about wealth. It spoke to a deeper medieval obsession with control over a chaotic world. If base metal could be perfected, perhaps so could humanity's fallen state. But there was always a shadow side. Manuscripts warned of the homunculus, a tiny artificial human rumored to be brewed in flasks. These creatures weren't just scientific curiosities. They embodied fears of playing God, of knowledge that could spiral into blasphemy. The Church's response to this symbolism was deeply conflicted. Some clergy embraced it, like Albertus Magnus, who wrote treatises on alchemy's spiritual parallels. Others saw it as a threat-encoded heresy masquerading as art. In the Book of Lambspring, a 16th century alchemical text, the artist hid Christian imagery within pagan symbols: a stag's antlers forming a cross, a lion's mane echoing the sun's rays. This visual duality let alchemists walk a razor's edge, paying lip service to orthodoxy while pursuing forbidden knowledge. Perhaps no symbol better captures this tension than the rubis, the alchemical hermaphrodite often shown with wings and a crown. At once male and female, earthly and divine, it represented the ultimate fusion, the transcendence of opposites. But to medieval eyes, such ambiguity was dangerous. It challenged rigid binaries of heaven and hell, purity and sin. Small wonder these images were often tucked into private manuscripts, hidden from public view. The legacy of these cryptic motifs lingers in unexpected places. Modern chemistry's atomic diagrams owe a debt to alchemy's geometric sigils, and the Ouroboros still coils through pop culture, from superhero logos to conspiracy theories. What began as medieval Europe's underground visual language became a blueprint for humanity's eternal dance with the unknown, a reminder that some fears and fascinations never truly fade. In the dim glow of a medieval chapel, a golden reliquary gleams on the altar, its glass pane revealing what appears to be a finger bone yellowed with age, wrapped in threadbare silk. To modern eyes, it might seem macabre, But to the faithful, this wasn't just a remnant of a saint. It was a conduit of divine power, capable of curing diseases, protecting villages, even turning the tide of battle. Relics weren't merely venerated, they were feared. Because if a saint's bone could work miracles, what horrors might a cursed object unleash? The hand of glory epitomized this duality, a severed limb, often from an executed criminal, pickled in salt and moonwort, its fingers fitted with candles made from human fat. Manuscripts describe it as a thief's tool, said to paralyze entire households while burglars ransacked their homes. But artists took the legend further, painting the hand as a sentient thing, its wax-dripping fingers curling like spider legs, its nails blackened with necrotic rot. These images weren't just warnings, they were proof of a world where the boundary between sacred and profane was terrifyingly thin. A relic could save you or summon something unspeakable. Churches capitalized on this fear with meticulous theatrics. The Sudarium of Oviedo, claimed to be Christ's burial cloth, was displayed only on select days, veiled in incense and candle smoke to heighten its mystique. Pilgrims would kneel for hours, hoping for a glimpse because to see it was to risk divine judgment. Was that stain on the fabric simply age or proof of your hidden sins? Art amplified the tension. In the Pilgrim's Guide to Santiago de Compostela, demons lurk at the edges of relic processions, their claws outstretched to snatch the unworthy. The message was clear: approach with awe or suffer the consequences. Yet relics also offered a perverse comfort. In a world ravaged by war and plague, they provided tangible connections to an invisible order. The tooth of Saint Apollonia could cure your abscess. The cloak of Saint Martin might shield your village from marauders, but the flip side was equally potent. A cursed amulet, say, a nail from a suicide's coffin, could blight crops or sour milk. These beliefs weren't superstitions, they were survival strategies. If you couldn't control fate, you could at least hedge your bets with the right object. Artists played both sides. In the hours of Catherine of Cleves, a pious woman prays before a reliquary, while, in the margin, an impish demon balances on a discarded mummified hand. The contrast is deliberate, holiness and horror forever entwined. Even architecture reflected this duality. Cathedrals stored relics in lavish shrines, but their crypts often hid darker artifacts, sealed lead cursed tablets, bones pierced with iron nails, buried to neutralize their malice. What's revealing is how these anxieties mirrored societal fractures. The wealthy could afford pilgrimages to touch a saint's skull. The poor might bury a witch's charm under their doorstep. Relics reinforced hierarchy, while cursed objects became tools of the powerless. A servant slipping a bewitched coin into their master's purse wasn't just folklore. It was resistance, however desperate. Today, we might dismiss these beliefs as primitive, but linger in a museum before a medieval reliquary, and you'll feel it, that prickle on your neck, the irrational urge to step back. The power of these objects never really faded. We just renamed it. Call it aura, energy, or luck. The medieval world knew one truth we still whisper: some things carry weight beyond their form. And whether that weight lifts you up or drags you down depends entirely on which side of the dark you stand. Dragons didn't just slither through medieval manuscripts. They ruled them, coiled around the edges of maps with scales glistening like polished armor, their jaws clamped around entire cities. These weren't the noble beasts of modern fantasy. They were pure, unfiltered terror incarnate. Artists depicted them with barbed tails and bat-like wings, often mid-devouring some hapless knight, their eyes gleaming with malicious intelligence. But why did these creatures dominate the medieval imagination? The answer lies in the margins of the world, literally. On the famous Hereford Mappa Mundi, dragons lurk beyond the edges of known lands, guarding the uncharted territories labeled simply, "Here be monsters." They were shorthand for the unknown, a warning that venturing too far might unleash forces beyond human control. Then there's the basilisk, a creature so horrifying its gaze could turn flesh to stone. Medieval bestiaries describe it as a serpent crowned with a white spot like a diadem, born from a rooster's egg hatched by a toad. Absurd, perhaps, but in an era where a single glance from a plague victim could spell death, the idea of a lethal stare struck a nerve. Artists leaned into the horror, painting the basilisk as a hybrid of serpent and rooster, its beak parted mid-screech, a sound said to be fatal. These weren't just fanciful illustrations, they were manifestations of very real fears about contagion and the invisible threats lurking in everyday life. Sea serpents, meanwhile, writhed across the pages of sailors' logs and church frescoes alike. The Carta Marina, a 16th-century map of Scandinavia, shows a beast with a horse's mane and a body longer than a galley, dragging sailors into the depths. What's revealing is how these creatures clustered near trade routes, places where ships vanished without explanation. When reality offered no answers, art filled the void. A sea serpent wasn't just a monster, it was the embodiment of storms, shipwrecks, and the crushing vastness of the ocean. But the genius of these artistic choices lies in their duality. By giving form to the unknown, sculpting it into dragons, basilisks, and serpents, medieval people could confront the chaos at their borders. A dragon guarding a forest edge wasn't just a threat. It was a boundary marker, a way to say this far, no further. The basilisk in a cathedral fresco reminded viewers that evil could wear a crown, that power unchecked might petrify the soul. Even the sea serpent, for all its terror, served a purpose. It made the incomprehensible tangible. Better a monster you could name than a void you couldn't fathom. What's haunting is how these symbols persist. The dragons of medieval maps still whisper in our modern obsession with "here be dragons," memes, and conspiracy theories. The basilisk's lethal gaze echoes in our fear of pandemics and invisible threats, and the sea serpent, it's alive and well in our deep-sea exploration myths, where we've swapped monsters for megafauna but kept the same primal awe. The beasts changed their skins, but the fears they carried never really left us. Nothing unsettles quite like the sight of a saint cradling their own decapitated head, their expression eerily serene as blood drips down their robes. Medieval artists had a peculiar obsession with depicting holy figures in the throes of grotesque martyrdom, Saint Denis preaching with his head in his hands, Saint Lucy offering her gouged-out eyes on a platter, Saint Agatha presenting her severed breasts on a tray. These weren't just macabre flourishes, they were theological power plays. The more brutal the suffering, the brighter the halo seemed to shine. Take the famous martyrdom of Saint Erasmus by Nicholas Dipper, where the saint lies pinned to a table as his intestines are slowly wound onto a winch. What's chilling isn't just the gore, it's the contrast. Erasmus's face glows with divine ecstasy, while his torturers grimace like demons. This visual paradox was the Church's ultimate propaganda. Pain was temporary, but glory was eternal. A peasant viewing this in a dim chapel might leave thinking, if Erasmus could endure that, perhaps I can survive my aching back and empty stomach. Yet these images served a darker, more pragmatic purpose. Saints weren't just role models, they were celestial enforcers. In The Golden Legend, a medieval bestseller, Saint Margaret doesn't just escape being swallowed by a dragon. She bursts from its belly, crucifix in hand, proving even the mightiest monsters were no match for faith. Churches displayed these stories like spiritual threat displays. A fresco of Saint Bartholomew being flayed alive wasn't merely educational, it was a warning. Disobey, and this could be you unless you repent. The most subversive details, though, lie in the saint's defiance. Saint Apollonia, her teeth shattered by pincers, is often shown gripping the tool herself, as if daring her tormentors to continue. This wasn't just piety, it was psychological warfare. By portraying martyrs as active participants in their own torture, artists flipped the script. The executioner became the weak one, dependent on the saints' cooperation. A 12th century manuscript even shows Saint Lawrence joking with his captors as he roasts on a gridiron. "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." What's often overlooked is how these portrayals mirrored medieval medicine. Saints' mutilated bodies functioned like spiritual anatomy lessons. Saint Roch points to the plague sore on his thigh, teaching viewers how to recognize divine punishment. Saint Fiacre, patron of hemorrhoid sufferers, sits on a rock that miraculously eased his pain, a medieval endorsement of ergonomic seating. Even suffering had a curriculum. The legacy of these images lingers in unexpected ways. Modern horror films owe a debt to medieval hagiography. Think of The Exorcist's body horror or Silence's martyrs. But there's a crucial difference. Where today's gore often revels in nihilism, medieval artists wrenched meaning from agony. A saint's severed head wasn't just a shock tactic. It was a promise. The worst the world could do would never be the end of the story. High atop the rain-slicked spires of Notre Dame, a stone menagerie leers down at the city below, part beast, part human, all nightmare. These gargoyles weren't just architectural flourishes, they were the Middle Ages' most paradoxical guardians, their grotesque forms straddling the line between sacred shield and omen of impending doom. Their very name whispers their dual nature derived from the Old French gargouille, meaning throat, referencing both the rainwater gushing from their gaping mouths and the guttural growls they seemed poised to unleash. Look closely at the gargoyles of Leon Cathedral, their elongated necks craning like vultures, their eyes bulging with manic intensity. Some clutch their own heads in apparent agony, while others grin with unsettling glee. This wasn't random grotesquerie. Medieval stonemasons drew from a deep well of symbolism: lion heads for courage, wolf maws for ferocity, hybrid creatures embodying the constant struggle between virtue and sin. The most chilling gargoyles, though, were the chimeras, purely decorative figures with no drainage function. Perched beside their spouting brethren, these silent watchers served one purpose: to unsettle. Their presence whispered, evil is real and it's always watching. But why adorn God's house with monsters? The answer lies in a medieval belief as old as faith itself, that the best way to ward off darkness was to name it, shape it, and trap it in stone. Gargoyles functioned like spiritual lightning rods, their terrifying visages diverting evil away from sacred ground. A 12th century manuscript from Cluny Abbey describes them as holy scarecrows, their ugliness so potent it repelled demons like a mirror held up to their own corruption. Yet there's a delicious irony here. The same features meant to frighten malevolent spirits often left parishioners trembling too. A pilgrim gazing up at the gargoyles of Rheims Cathedral might wonder, are these creatures keeping hell at bay, or are they its advance scouts? The Church capitalized on this ambiguity. By daylight, priests explained gargoyles as defeated evils, frozen in perpetual torment as warnings. But by night, when shadows brought their stone limbs to eerie life, the message shifted. The grotesques became proof of the supernatural battles raging unseen, proof that the Church was the only bulwark against chaos. This psychological theater reached its peak during storms, when rainwater spewed from gargoyle mouths like demonic vomit, turning entire cathedrals into immersive morality plays. What modern viewers often miss is how personal these creatures felt to medieval eyes. Many gargoyles were modeled after local legends. The Dragon of Rowan said to demand human sacrifices, the werewolf of Dole that stalked plague years. Others caricatured societal outcasts, a hook-nosed moneylender here, a sneering heretic there. In Strasbourg, one gargoyle even bears the face of a rival stonemason, immortalized in ridicule. These weren't just decorations, they were communal exorcisms, turning shared fears into shared stone. Today, we've sanitized gargoyles into Gothic kitsch, forgetting their original power. But stand beneath one during a thunderstorm and you'll feel it, that primal prickle on your neck. Their genius was their duality, monstrous enough to repel evil, yet familiar enough to reflect it back at us. In the end, gargoyles weren't just guardians or omens. They were mirrors, forcing medieval society to confront the demons within and the fragile faith that kept them at bay. In the shadowy recesses of a medieval chapel, the Virgin Mary's blue robes glow like a beacon, while just inches away, a demon's crimson skin seems to pulse with hellfire. Color wasn't just decoration in medieval art, it was a weapon, a psychological trigger carefully deployed to manipulate emotions and reinforce dogma. Black, the absence of light, was more than just the shade of mourning. It was the void itself, the abyss where sinners tumbled into eternal night. Artists mixed soot and crushed bone to create this consuming darkness, painting it onto the robes of the damned in Last Judgment scenes. In the Tres Riches Huras du Duc de Berry, the devil's wings are rendered in Inkai strokes so deep they seem to swallow the parchment, a visual metaphor for how sin could erase the soul. Then there was red, the color of fresh wounds and spilled sacramental wine. In the Rohan hours, martyrs bleed vermilion rivers so vivid they appear wet, their suffering magnified by the contrast against pale skin. But red's duality was its power. The same hue that symbolized Christ's sacrifice also whispered of carnal sin. A scarlet trim on a noblewoman's sleeve might hint at vanity, while the flushed cheeks of a feasting monk could foreshadow gluttony's punishment. The finest pigments came from crushed insects or rare minerals, making red literally the color of blood and treasure, both dangerously intoxicating. Pale greens and grays, often mixed from verdigris or lead white, carried their own grim messages. In transi-tomb sculptures, corpses were painted in sickly celadon, their flesh resembling moldering cheese. This wasn't just realism, it was a deliberate evocation of decay, a reminder that even kings turned putrid. The greenish pallor of Judas in Giotto's frescoes marked him as spiritually rancid long before his betrayal, but the most fascinating manipulation lay in gold leaf. Applied to halos and heavenly scenes, it shimmered under candlelight, creating a flickering illusion of divine presence. In the Vienna Genesis, entire backgrounds blaze with gold, making earthly scenes feel transcendent. Yet this brilliance had a dark counterpart. Artists often left hellscapes matte and dull, the absence of gold amplifying their desolation. These choices weren't arbitrary. Medieval color theory tied hues to the four humors, the planets, even musical notes. A sickly yellow might signal bile and madness, while deep blue echoed the Virgin's purity and the vast, unknowable heavens. By controlling color, artists didn't just depict fear, they weaponized it, turning pigments into psychological traps. A pilgrim staring at a blood-red demon would feel their pulse quicken long before they processed the scene's details. What's haunting is how these associations linger. Funeral black, danger red, corpse gray, medieval color coding still whispers in our subconscious, proof that the palette of fear is timeless. The next time you flinch at a horror movie's crimson splash or a shadow's Inkai swell, remember, you're reacting to a visual language forged in the Middle Ages, one that taught us to see darkness in color long before we had words to name it. Long before the church standardized its imagery of hell and damnation, ordinary people whispered stories of older, wilder terrors, tales that crept into the margins of sacred art like ivy cracking through cathedral stones. Take the legend of the Wild Hunt, a ghostly procession said to thunder across stormy skies, led by a spectral figure sometimes called Hurler, Woden, or even King Arthur. In the 12th century Winchester Psalter, we see its echo, a frieze of skeletal riders galloping beneath Christ's feet at the Last Judgment, their horses' ribs visible through taut skin. This wasn't biblical, this was folklore repurposed to amplify the Church's message that even the oldest pagan fears now served Christian ends. Regional legends left particularly vivid marks. In Alpine churches, frescoes of Saint Michael slaying the dragon often borrowed details from local tales of the Tatzelwurm, a lizard-like monster blamed for vanishing livestock. The saint's victory wasn't just over abstract evil, it was a direct rebuttal to the creature haunting villagers' dreams. Similarly, the Slavic Vila, spirits of wronged women who controlled storms, morphed into the winged demons of Balkan icons, their flowing hair and white robes preserved even as their roles shifted from folkloric beings to minions of Satan. Some of the most haunting blends appear in the Danse Macabre tradition. In Switzerland, the skeletal figure of death sometimes wears a peasant's pointed hat, a nod to the Elplamagronen, a mountain spirit said to lead travelers astray. Over time, these localized details became shorthand. A German woodcut might show death with a scythe, but in Brittany, he carried an oyster knife, a tool familiar to coastal communities where drowning was a constant threat. The line between protection and terror blurred in these adaptations. A Welsh carving of a CW circumflex en Annon, a spectral hound from Celtic myth guarding a church door, served dual purposes. To the faithful, it was a Christianized guardian. To those who remembered older stories, it was a reminder that the old powers still lurked, now harnessed by the new faith. Even the grotesque Sheila Noggig figures, their exaggerated vulva displayed on church walls, likely descended from pre-Christian fertility symbols, their shock value repurposed to warn against lust. What's revealing is how these folk motifs outlasted their origins. The Lindworm, a limbless dragon from Scandinavian lore, slithered into church carvings as Satan's serpent. But in remote areas, older meanings persisted. A Norwegian farmer might still touch the carving for protection against crop blight, whispering a charm his grandparents taught him, proof that art could never fully erase the stories etched into the land itself. These hybrid images tell a deeper truth. Medieval fear was never monolithic. It was a patchwork of local dreads stitched together by artists who understood that the most potent warnings weren't universal but personal. A demon modeled after your grandmother's story about the bogeyman would always strike deeper than a generic devil. And so, in the flickering candlelight of a village chapel, folklore and doctrine merged, not to conquer superstition, but to weaponize it. In a dimly lit panel from a 15th century altarpiece, a man tears at his hair, his eyes rolled back to reveal bloodshot whites while shadowy figures whisper in his ears. Medieval artists didn't just paint madness, they weaponized it, transforming psychological anguish into a battleground between heaven and hell. What we'd now recognize as depression or psychosis was often rendered as demonic possession, with sufferers depicted as vessels for grotesque imps or cursed by the touch of a wrathful saint. The Temptation of St. Anthony triptychs are particularly telling. Swarms of gnarled creatures claw at the hermit's robes, their distorted faces mirroring the inner torment of a mind under siege. These weren't compassionate portrayals, they were cautionary tales, reinforcing the idea that mental suffering signaled moral failure. The Melancholia Eye engraving by Albrecht Dürer offers a rare exception, a brooding angel surrounded by scientific tools, her face heavy with a sadness that feels startlingly human. Yet even here, the zodiac sign Scorpio lurks in the corner, hinting at astrological affliction rather than medical understanding. More typical were manuscripts like the Ars Moriendi, where the despairing man writhes on his deathbed, a demon perched on his chest to symbolize suicidal thoughts as Satan's victory. The message was clear: melancholy wasn't an illness to treat, but a spiritual test to endure. What's heartbreaking is how these depictions shaped real lives. Historical records describe fools chained in churches for exorcisms, their tremors and cries interpreted as evidence of demonic occupation. In the Hours of Catherine of Cleves, a marginal illustration shows a barefoot man howling at the moon, his tunic ripped open to reveal a swarm of black beetles crawling from his chest, a visual metaphor for intrusive thoughts as literal infestation. The line between patient and sinner blurred so completely that treatments often involved more prayer than palliative care, yet hidden in these grim portrayals are glimpses of resistance. The Ship of Fools, a popular motif in Renaissance art, turned stigma on its head by showing madmen sailing blissfully away from society's judgment. In Bosch's version, passengers happily guzzle wine while a nun strums a lute, suggesting madness might offer freedom from rigid norms. Even the possessed had agency in some artworks, like the possessed boy in a Spanish fresco who points accusingly at his own tormentors, implicating the community's neglect as much as any demon. The legacy of these images still shadows modern attitudes. The medieval trope of the holy fool persists in romanticized notions of mental illness as artistic genius, while the demonic possession narrative fuels stigma around conditions like schizophrenia. But perhaps the most enduring lesson lies in the art's unintended honesty. By externalizing mental anguish as monsters and curses, medieval artists revealed a truth we still grapple with today. The real terror wasn't the suffering, it was the fear of facing it without answers. A woman's face peers from the pages of a medieval manuscript, her lips curled in a knowing smile, her hair coiled like serpents around a mirror reflecting not her own image but the fires of hell. This wasn't just an illustration, it was a battleground. In the medieval imagination, female power wasn't simply dangerous, it was demonic. From Eve offering the forbidden fruit to the seductive sirens luring sailors to their doom, artists weaponized women's bodies into cautionary tales, transforming natural autonomy into something monstrous. The Hortus Deliciarum shows a naked woman riding a seven-headed beast, her flowing hair morphing into the tongues of serpents. What's chilling isn't just the imagery, it's the subtext. A woman uncontrolled was a woman unleashing chaos. The witch became the ultimate vessel for these fears. In Hans Baldung Green's woodcuts, naked crones straddle goats backward, their sagging breasts and wild hair defying every ideal of feminine purity. But look closer and you'll spot the telltale details. The stolen Eucharist wafer tucked in her basket, the cat with human eyes, symbols of inverted sacraments and heresy. These weren't generic monsters, they were indictments of women who dared to exist outside male authority, their very bodies framed as sites of corruption. A 15th century French legal text even claimed witches could steal penises and store them in birds' nests, a ludicrous yet revealing fantasy of female power, literally dismantling masculinity. Even virtuous women weren't safe from this visual policing. The Virgin Mary might be enthroned in gold, but her counterparts, the fallen women, were painted with deliberate grotesquerie. In the Bible Moralise, a prostitute's body is covered in sores, her skin greenish as if rotting from within. The message was visceral: sexual autonomy equaled decay. Meanwhile, medical manuscripts depicted the female womb as a wild animal that could wander the body, causing hysteria unless tamed by marriage or childbearing. The female form in art was never just a body, it was a battleground for control. What's often overlooked is how these images intersected with real-life persecution. The Malleus Maleficarum, a witch hunter's manual, described women as naturally more carnal and thus prone to demonic pacts. Artists echoed this, painting accused witches with elongated nipples, said to feed demon familiars, or surrounded by jars of flying ointment that were likely just herbal remedies. These weren't neutral depictions, they were visual lynching ropes. A German broadsheet from 1587 shows a suspected witch being stripped and searched for the devil's mark, her humiliation rendered in lurid detail for public consumption. Yet amid this terror, cracks appear. In the Smithfield Decretals, a marginal doodle shows a woman beating a devil with her distaff, a rare glimpse of resistance. Even the ubiquitous mermaid, often a symbol of dangerous lust, sometimes holds a comb and mirror not as vanity, but as tools for self-possession. These subtle rebellions hint at the truth behind the hysteria. The women who scared medieval society weren't monsters. They were healers, midwives, widows who refused remarriage anyone who threatened the fragile hierarchy. The legacy of these images still haunts. The witch's pointed hat and broomstick are Halloween costumes now, but their origins the fear of women who lived alone, knew herb lore, or simply said no linger in modern misogyny. Medieval art didn't just depict female evil, it invented it stroke by deliberate stroke, until the very idea of a woman ungoverned became the most terrifying canvas of all. Judas Iscariot dangles from a withered tree, his bloated belly split open like overripe fruit, spilling entrails onto the rocks below. This wasn't just biblical storytelling, it was medieval shock therapy, a visceral warning etched into church walls and illuminated manuscripts. Artists didn't merely depict Judas's suicide, they weaponized it, turning his death into a grotesque spectacle of divine retribution. In the Biblia Pauperum, his body twists mid-air, his neck grotesquely elongated by the rope's tension, while demons swarm to claim his soul before it even leaves his lips. The message was unsubtle. Betrayal wasn't just a sin, it was a one-way ticket to eternal torment. What's striking is how these portrayals evolved beyond scripture. The Bible mentions Judas hanging himself, but medieval artists added chilling details. In the Hortus Deliciarum, his intestines burst forth as if his body rejects its own corruption. Giotto's Scrovegni Chapel fresco shows him with blackened skin, already rotting before death, a visual shorthand for spiritual decay. This creative license reveals a deeper anxiety. Judas wasn't just a historical figure. He was every backstabber, every oath breaker, every neighbor who might sell you out for 30 pieces of silver. By making his suffering hypervisible, artists transformed abstract treachery into something you could almost smell. The location of Judas's damnation carried symbolic weight too. Often placed near church entrances or choir screens, his image confronted worshippers at liminal spaces, thresholds between sacred and profane. At St. Lazare d'Autun, he's carved beside the doorway, his mouth stretched in a silent scream as demons drag him into the abyss. Pilgrims would literally step over him to enter, a tactile reminder. Betrayal stains the soul like mud on a threshold. Yet the most unsettling twist lies in the coins. In countless paintings, Judas's silver spills from his purse mid-fall, the very currency of his sin now useless. The Gospel of Barnabas even claims the coins fused to his palms, a detail artists literalized by showing his hands permanently clenched, as if greed petrified him. This wasn't just morality play, it was economic commentary. In an era where feudal loyalty vied with rising mercantilism, Judas became the ultimate cautionary tale. A prophet at the cost of honor leads only to ruin. The legacy of this motif lingers in unexpected ways. Modern films like The Last Temptation of Christ still frame Judas's death as the ultimate fall, his silhouette swaying against stormy skies. But peel back the layers and you'll find medieval artists' true mastery. They made betrayal feel inevitable and horrifyingly intimate, that shadowy figure in the fresco. He wasn't just Judas, he was the friend who might desert you, the lord who might abandon his vassals, the traitor lurking in every human heart. Gluttony wasn't just a sin in medieval art, it was a grotesque spectacle of excess, a body turned against itself. Picture a bloated figure crammed into the margins of a manuscript, their belly spilling over their belt like rising dough, their face buried in a plate while demons shovel food into their already overflowing mouth. In the Hortus Deliciarum, a 12th century encyclopedia, Gluttony rides a pig, his swollen fingers clutching a roasted fowl and a goblet, his skin tinged green from overindulgence. The details were deliberate. The pig symbolized filth, the greenish hue evoked sickness, and the sheer scale of his body made the sin impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about eating too much, it was about consumption as self-destruction, a warning that indulgence could literally distort the soul. Greed, by contrast, was often rendered as a skeletal figure, their flesh stretched tight over bones from hoarding rather than nourishing. In the Speculum Humani Salvationis, a gaunt miser crouches over a chest of coins, his elongated fingers like claws, his eyes wide with paranoia. What's chilling is the way artists depicted money as a physical burden, chains of coins dragging the greedy into hell, or gold melting into molten liquid they're forced to drink in the afterlife. The Grimm brothers' later fairy tales borrowed this imagery, but medieval artists perfected it. Greed wasn't just desire, it was a kind of spiritual starvation where the more you accumulated, the less human you became. Then there was lust, perhaps the most visually inventive of the sins. Artists avoided simple titillation, instead crafting disturbing hybrids, part human, part animal figures locked in grotesque embraces. A 15th century French manuscript shows lust as a woman with a serpent's tail, her breasts nibbled by toads, symbolizing how desire could corrupt the flesh. In Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights, couples cavort inside translucent bubbles, their pleasure literally fragile, destined to pop into damnation. Even the colors told a story. Lust's figures were often painted in feverish reds or sickly pinks, their bodies merging with the very flames that would eventually consume them. The genius of these depictions lay in their specificity. A lazy viewer might see a fat man or a clutching miser, but the details whispered deeper truths. Gluttony's pig wasn't just an animal, it was a mirror of the sinner's dehumanization. Greed's coins weren't just wealth, they were the weights that would sink a soul. And lust's serpents weren't just reptiles, they were the consequences slithering into bed with every forbidden act. What's often overlooked is how these images shifted with societal fears. During famines, gluttony became more monstrous, his feasting an affront to the starving. In times of economic upheaval, greed sprouted extra hands, stealing from the poor. And as the church tightened its grip on sexuality, lust's punishments grew more inventive, sinners frozen in ice, or forced to embrace the same demons they'd courted in life. The sins weren't static, they evolved like living nightmares, reflecting whatever terrified society most in a given century. Today, we might dismiss these as overblown moralizing. But scroll through social media, and you'll see the same sins repackaged: the influencer gorging on attention, the billionaire hoarding resources, the commodification of desire. Medieval artists would have recognized them instantly. The monsters changed their costumes, but the fears they embodied never really left us. In the echoing halls of European cathedrals, stone carvings leer down with hollow eyes, skeletal minstrels plucking rib bone lutes, nobles mid-rot with worms spilling from their embroidered sleeves. This wasn't mere morbidity, it was a full-blown cultural obsession, a fascination with decay so pervasive it bordered on reverence. To understand why medieval artists fetishized the grotesque, we must step into a world where life was shadowed by constant peril. The average person in the 14th century would witness famine, plague, and war before their 20th birthday. In such a landscape, the macabre wasn't just entertainment, it was a survival tactic, a way to stare into the abyss until the abyss blinked first. Take the trancy tombs of the late Middle Ages, where sculpted corpses weren't idealized in peaceful repose but shown in advanced decomposition, lips shriveled back from grinning teeth, intestines spilling like knotted ropes. The tomb of Cardinal Jean de la Grange in Avignon goes further, pairing his living effigy with a rotting doppelganger beneath, the two figures locked in silent dialogue. This grisly duality served a profound psychological purpose. By confronting the inevitability of decay head-on, medieval viewers could rob death of its terror. If even a cardinal's flesh putrefied, perhaps there was dignity in accepting one's fate. Yet the macabre also functioned as social satire. The Danse Macabre frescoes weren't just about mortality, they were biting commentary on class hierarchies. A skeletal jester might mock a bishop's pomp by mimicking his gestures with bony fingers, while a decaying king still clutched his rusting crown. In the charnel house of the Innocents in Paris, murals showed death as a great equalizer, toppling merchants from their money chests and plucking children from their cradles with the same indifferent grin. The grotesque became the ultimate critique, revealing the vanity of earthly power in the face of universal decay. Artists weaponized disgust to enforce moral lessons. The Hours of Catherine of Cleves includes a margin illustration of a well-dressed noblewoman whose reflection in a mirror reveals a bloated corpse, a direct jab at vanity. In the Ars Moriendi manuscripts, demons with bloated bellies and oozing sores tempt the dying, their physical repulsiveness mirroring the spiritual corruption they represent. This wasn't subtlety, it was shock therapy, using visceral imagery to sear lessons into the viewer's memory. The cult of the macabre also reveals a paradoxical comfort. By giving form to fears, sculpting them into gargoyles, painting them onto altarpieces, medieval people could exert a sliver of control. A carved demon on a cathedral roof was a demon named and thus diminished. A painted hellscape was a threat that could be avoided. Even the memento mori jewelry, with its tiny skulls and coffin motifs, served as wearable reminders that life's brevity made every moment precious. What modern audiences often miss is the humor woven through the horror. The coffin of the three living and the three dead from Normandy shows skeletal figures gleefully dragging reluctant nobles toward their graves, one corpse even playing a bone flute. This gallows humor wasn't nihilism, it was resilience. When death lurked around every corner, laughter became a shield. The legacy of this aesthetic still pulses through contemporary culture. Gothic literature, horror films, even the zombie apocalypse genre, all descend from medieval artists who understood that to stare unflinchingly at darkness is to strip it of its power. Their grotesquerie wasn't just about fear, it was about forging a strange, defiant beauty from the very things that terrified them most. A king stares down from a stained glass window, his crown ablaze with divine light while skeletal figures grovel at his feet. This wasn't just portraiture, it was psychological warfare. Medieval rulers and clergy didn't merely commission art, they weaponized it, crafting visual narratives so potent they could mobilize armies, justify massacres, and bend entire populations to their will. Consider the Chronica Majora, where Matthew Paris depicted Emperor Frederick Roman II as a three-headed beast, one head a king, another a priest, the third a snarling demon. This grotesque caricature wasn't idle mockery. It was papal propaganda during the bitter struggle between church and state. designed to turn public opinion against the emperor by framing him as literally monstrous. The Crusades offer some of the most blatant examples. In the Winchester Psalter, a 12th century manuscript, Muslim warriors are rendered with grotesque facial distortions, hooked noses, bulging eyes, and snarling mouths that mirror contemporaneous depictions of demons. These weren't accurate representations, they were dehumanizing tools, transforming complex political conflicts into holy wars against the infidel horde. The Livres d'Esmerveille took it further, illustrating Saracens worshipping a golden idol with Mohammed's face, a deliberate falsehood to stoke outrage. Art didn't just document the Crusades, it fueled them, turning abstract enemies into tangible devils deserving of slaughter. Ecclesiastical propaganda was equally calculated. The Bible Moralise, a luxury picture Bible for French royalty, paired Old Testament scenes with allegorical parallels, casting heretics as venomous serpents and the church as a radiant queen crushing them underfoot. The subtext was unmistakable. Dissent wasn't just wrong, it was a cosmic battle between light and darkness. Even the architecture played its part. Gothic cathedrals soared heavenward not just to inspire, but to intimidate, their vaulted ceilings and towering spires physically dwarfing worshippers, reinforcing the church's absolute authority. Royal portraiture employed similar tactics. When Richard Roman II commissioned the Wilton diptych, he didn't just want a likeness, he staged a celestial endorsement. The panel shows him kneeling as the Virgin and Child bless him, surrounded by saints whose royalist sympathies were, at best, questionable. The message. His rule wasn't just political, it was divinely ordained. Rebellions weren't merely treason, they were sacrilege, but the darkest brilliance lay in the fusion of terror and hope. A peasant viewing the Last Judgment at Autun Cathedral would see their local bishop enthroned among the saved, while rebels and tax evaders writhed in hell. The calculus was brutal: obey, and you'd join the radiant elect; resist, and your likeness might adorn the next fresco of the damned. What's chilling is how these strategies echo today: the demonization of enemies through caricature, the conflation of power with piety, the use of spectacle to mask oppression. Medieval rulers understood something we often forget. Fear isn't just an emotion, it's a palette, and art is its most enduring canvas. The grotesque gargoyles of Notre Dame and the skeletal figures of the Danse Macabre didn't vanish with the Middle Ages. They shape-shifted, slithering into the DNA of modern horror. Take the haunted house, that staple of horror films and Halloween attractions. Its creaking floorboards and ghostly whispers owe a debt to medieval memento mori art, where skulls grinned from the corners of wealthy homes as reminders of mortality. The difference, where a 15th century noble might keep a carved ivory death's head on his desk to meditate on life's brevity, today's jump-scare specters in The Conjuring or The Haunting of Hill House tap into that same existential dread, weaponizing the domestic space as a theater of terror. Even the architecture echoes the past. The looming, shadow-drenched corridors of Gothic mansions mirror the dimly lit naves of medieval cathedrals, where flickering candlelight once brought stone demons to life. Zombie apocalypses, too, are medieval nightmares in modern clothing. The rotting hordes of The Walking Dead or 28 Days Later are distant cousins to the trancy tomb sculptures, where corpses were depicted mid-decay, their flesh peeling away to reveal the inevitability of death. But there's a darker parallel: the Black Death's mass graves and the terrified survivors who burned entire villages to contain the contagion mirror today's quarantine narratives and frenzied mobs in films like World War Z. Medieval artists painted plague saints like Sebastian riddled with arrows, his body a pincushion of suffering, a visual precursor to the virus ravaged victims of Contagion or The Last of Us, where illness isn't just a plot device but a visceral manifestation of societal collapse. Even the demonic possession tropes that dominate horror cinema, from The Exorcist to Hereditary, are steeped in medieval theology. The Malleus Maleficarum, that infamous witch-hunting manual, described demons invading bodies through witches' marks or whispered curses. Artists like Hieronymus Bosch literalized these fears, painting victims with distended bellies housing miniature devils, their skin bubbling with otherworldly corruption. Modern films simply swapped the medieval exorcist's crucifix for a psychiatrist's notebook, but the core terror remains unchanged: the violation of the self, the body turned against its owner. The spinning head and pea soup vomit of the exorcist's Regan, that's pure medieval grotesquerie, updated for the age of special effects. The most haunting legacy, though, lies in the psychological horror genre. Medieval Last Judgment frescoes didn't just scare viewers, they forced introspection, holding up a mirror to the soul. Similarly, films like The Babadook or Get Out weaponize symbolism to probe deeper fears: racism, grief, maternal rage. The Babadook's shadowy monster, emerging from a children's book, recalls the way medieval artists personified sin as tangible creatures, greed as a coin-eyed demon, lust as a serpent-tongued temptress. Both eras understand that the most potent horrors aren't the ones that lurk in shadows, but the ones we recognize within ourselves. From the skeletal horsemen of the Seventh Seal to the folk horror rituals of Midsummer, medievalism thrives in horror because it speaks a universal language of fear. The gargoyles on the cathedral didn't just guard against evil, they gave it a face, making the unknown feel conquerable. Modern horror does the same, dressing ancient dread in new metaphors. The next time you watch a zombie horde shambling across the screen or a ghostly hand reaching from a mirror, remember, you're not just seeing a trope. You're witnessing a 1,000-year-old nightmare still whispering in the dark, hidden in the margins of medieval manuscripts and carved into the weathered stones of forgotten chapels. Some symbols resist interpretation, twisted knots with no beginning or end, beasts with too many eyes, geometric patterns that seem to pulse with secret meaning. These aren't mere decorations, they're puzzles left by artists who took their secrets to the grave. Take the Voynich manuscript, that infamous book of botanical illustrations and unreadable text. Its pages swarm with plants that don't exist and nude women bathing in emerald green tubes, their purpose as inscrutable today as when the book was penned 6 centuries ago. But lesser-known enigmas lurk everywhere: the Sheila Nogig figures clutching their exaggerated vulvas on church walls, the green man with foliage bursting from his mouth, even the cryptic Wheel of Fortune motifs where kings rise and fall without explanation. What's fascinating is how these symbols cluster around moments of cultural upheaval. The Templar graffiti found in coastal caves, crosses within circles, sword-like markings, appear most densely during the Order's persecution. Were they coded pleas for help, maps to hidden treasures, or simply the frantic scratches of condemned men? Similarly, the Beatus manuscripts of Spain feature apocalyptic beasts with 7 heads and 10 horns, their symbolism so layered that modern scholars still debate whether they represent Islamic invaders, Roman emperors, or cosmic chaos. The ambiguity itself may have been the point art as a Rorschach test for an era's deepest fears. Some motifs hint at older, suppressed beliefs clinging to the edges of Christian art. The Alemannic brooches of early medieval Europe bear intricate serpent, designs that echo pre-Christian worship of dragons as earth deities. Over time, these serpents slither into church carvings as Satan, but was the transformation complete? A 12th century capital in Vézelay Abbey shows a mermaid holding her twin tails apart to reveal a cross, a startling fusion of pagan allure and Christian redemption. Such hybrid symbols suggest a world where old gods didn't die. They went underground, camouflaged in saintly garb. Then there are the truly eerie outliers. The labyrinth at Chartres Cathedral, its winding path once trodden by penitents on their knees, mirrors ancient Cretan designs. But was it a metaphor for spiritual journeying or a covert homage to older mystery cults? The Triskelion carvings in Irish monasteries, with their 3 interlocked spirals, predate Christianity by millennia. Did monks preserve them as cultural heritage, or did the symbol's hypnotic power simply refuse to fade? The most haunting enigmas are those that mirror universal human anxieties. The hand of God emerging from clouds to smite sinners appears across Europe, but in a Bavarian chapel, the same motif shows the hand receiving a tiny soul, a subtle shift from wrath to mercy that scholars still can't contextualize. Similarly, the dog-headed Saint Christopher of Eastern Orthodox icons, part man, part beast, may reflect medieval rumors of cannibal tribes in far lands, or perhaps a deeper fear that the boundary between human and monster was thinner than anyone dared admit. Perhaps these symbols resist decoding because they were never meant to be solved. Like the gargoyles snarling from cathedral eaves, their power lies in the questions they provoke. To a modern eye, they're curiosities, but to the medieval mind, they may have been something far more potent, whispers from a world where not all truths could be spoken aloud, where some fears were too vast to name. Beneath the floorboards of a Spanish monastery, archaeologists brush away centuries of dust to reveal a hidden fresco, not of saints or angels, but of a horned demon with hollow eyes, its mouth stretched wide as if frozen mid-scream. This discovery, unearthed in 2019, isn't an anomaly. Across Europe, modern technology is peeling back layers of whitewash and time to expose medieval art that was literally buried, sometimes by later generations ashamed of its graphic terror, other times by the original creators themselves, as if the images were too dangerous to leave uncovered. In Norwich, England, thermal imaging recently detected a previously unknown doom painting beneath a church's plaster. Its scenes of damnation so vivid that conservators describe the sulfurous yellows of hellfire as still glowing after 600 years. Ground-penetrating radar has become an unlikely time machine for art historians. At Burgos Cathedral in Spain, scans revealed a network of hidden tunnels where artists sketched preliminary designs for grotesques, their margins filled with notes like, "Make this one more frightening," or "Add serpents here." These discarded drafts expose the deliberate craftsmanship behind medieval horror, proving that every leering gargoyle and twisted demon was meticulously planned to maximize dread. Even more telling are the pigments analyzed from these sites. The soot black used for demonic skin often contained trace amounts of lead and mercury, metals believed to be alive with dark energy. Artists weren't just painting monsters, they were brewing them. Some of the most chilling rediscoveries come from unexpected places. During renovations at a French farmhouse in 2021, workers tore down a false wall to find a 14th century memento mori mural, a grinning skeleton offering a mirror to a nobleman, its surface reflecting not his face but a skull. The paint had been mixed with crushed bone, a forensic analysis later confirmed, likely from the very corpse it depicted. This macabre recycling wasn't just thrift. Medieval people believed incorporating real remains into art could channel their power. A similar find in Germany yielded a prayer book with pages dyed purple using ink infused with human ashes, turning sacred text into a literal relic. But perhaps the most profound revelations come from digital reconstruction. At Pisa's Camposanto Monumentale, firebombs in World War II charred frescoes of the triumph of death until a recent project called The Last Things used AI to restore their original terror. The rebuilt images show a cavalcade of skeletons trampling nobles and clergy alike, their decaying fingers snatching at silks and sacraments with equal glee. What's striking is how these restored details confirm historical accounts of the Black Death's psychological scars. The fresco's background, now visible for the first time in 80 years, includes a collapsed cityscape eerily resembling plague-ravaged Pisa itself, proof that medieval artists didn't just imagine hell. They painted from life. Each of these discoveries does more than expand art history. They rewrite our understanding of how fear functioned in the medieval world. A recently decoded ledger from Bruges reveals that churches paid extra for artists who'd survived the plague, their trauma deemed essential for capturing hell's authenticity. In Vienna, a stash of broken stained glass shards, once thought to be trash, was reassembled to show a previously unknown scene of the Antichrist, not as a monster, but as a handsome merchant, his true nature visible only in the greenish tint of his shadow. These finds remind us that medieval horror wasn't static. It evolved with each new catastrophe, its imagery adapting to fresh terrors like a virus mutating to survive. The irony is palpable. Centuries after being hidden, these artworks are more relevant than ever. When a team at Oxford used spectral imaging to uncover erased demons in a Welsh psalter, they found the creatures' poses matched modern descriptions of sleep paralysis hallucinations, suggesting some fears transcend time. Likewise, the rediscovery of a Swiss dance macabre scroll, its dancers arranged in strict social order, feels uncomfortably familiar in an age of pandemics and inequality. The medieval world may have lacked our science, but they understood something we're still grappling with. Terror isn't just an emotion, it's a language, and their art speaks it fluently. One of the biggest misconceptions about medieval art is that every grotesque carving or eerie symbol was meant to terrify. Take gargoyles, for instance. Today, we see them as grim sentinels of doom, but many served a surprisingly practical purpose. Those gaping mouths weren't just for show, they were rain spouts channeling water away from cathedral walls to prevent erosion. The same goes for the infamous Sheila Nogig figures, often misinterpreted as obscene or demonic. While their exaggerated features shock modern eyes, historians suggest they might have been protective talismans, warding off evil spirits with their startling imagery rather than inviting darkness in. Another myth worth dismantling is the idea that medieval artists were fixated on hellfire and damnation. While scenes of punishment abound, they were often paired with messages of hope. The Last Judgment tympanums didn't just showcase the damned, they highlighted the saved bathed in golden light, their faces turned toward paradise. Even the Danse Macabre, with its skeletal revelers, carried a surprisingly egalitarian message. Death comes for everyone, yes, but that also meant no one was alone in their fate. The macabre wasn't purely about fear, it was a reminder of shared humanity. Then there's the assumption that all hybrid creatures, dragons, chimeras, and beastly demons, were symbols of evil. In reality, many straddled the line between menace and protection. The basilisk, for example, was feared for its lethal gaze, but its image also appeared on amulets meant to repel other dangers. Even the Green Man, with his foliage-spewing mouth, wasn't necessarily a pagan holdout but a celebration of nature's cyclical rebirth, seamlessly integrated into Christian art. Perhaps the most persistent misunderstanding revolves around the Wheel of Fortune. Modern interpretations often paint it as a fatalistic metaphor for life's unpredictability, but medieval viewers saw it differently. The wheel's turning wasn't just arbitrary, it was a call to humility. Kings rising and falling on its spokes served as a visual sermon. Earthly power is fleeting, but divine grace is constant. The takeaway: medieval art was far more nuanced than we give it credit for. What reads as pure horror today often carried layers of meaning, practical, spiritual, even darkly humorous. The next time you encounter a grinning demon or a skeletal saint, remember, the past didn't just speak in screams, it whispered, warned, and sometimes even laughed. So as we step back from these haunting images, the skeletal dancers, the watchful gargoyles, the damned writhing in eternal fire, let's turn the mirror inward. Which of these medieval fears still lingers in your bones? Maybe it's the relentless specter of the Danse Macabre, that grinning reminder that time spares no one, not the wealthy merchant nor the starving beggar. In an age of productivity hacks and life expectancy charts, do you ever feel death's bony finger tap your shoulder when scrolling through milestones you haven't reached? Or perhaps it's the demons, not the fire-breathing monsters of frescoes, but the ones that wear human faces. The medieval fear of hidden evil, of neighbors who might betray you for silver or whisper curses under their breath, feels uncomfortably familiar in an era of online anonymity and curated personas. How often do we still scan crowds for threats, real or imagined, just as a peasant might have side-eyed the traveler from a plague-stricken town? Then there's the terror of the unseen, the plague that crept in with no warning, the famine that gnawed at entire villages while kings feasted. Today, we've swapped pestilence for pandemics, crop failures for climate crises, but the paralyzing dread of forces beyond our control, that hasn't changed. When the news cycle spins with disasters, do you ever feel like a medieval farmer staring at the sky, praying the storms won't come? And what about the wheel of fortune, that cruel arbiter of fate? One day you're crowned in gold, the next you're choking on ashes. In a world of viral fame and sudden cancellations, of stock market crashes and algorithmic whims, the medieval obsession with fortune's fickleness doesn't seem so archaic. Ever had a moment where life flipped like a fresco's tableau, stability crumbling beneath your feet? Here's the twist: medieval people didn't just cower before these fears. They painted them, carved them, wore them as rings and pendants. By giving shape to the unknown, they robbed it of some power. So tell me, what's your modern memento mori? The notification that your storage is almost full, the birthday that slipped by unnoticed, the way your reflection changes when you're not looking. The Middle Ages whisper across the centuries, you're not alone in the dark. Now pass the candle. From the skeletal grin of a Danse Macabre fresco to the hollow eyes of a cathedral gargoyle, medieval artists didn't just depict fear, they gave it a language. These haunting images were more than warnings or propaganda. They were a collective coping mechanism, a way to carve order from the chaos of plagues, wars, and existential dread. What's striking is how little has changed. Swap the parchment for pixels, and you'll see the same shadows lurking in modern horror films, dystopian novels, and even viral conspiracy theories. The Alien franchise's chestbursters echo medieval depictions of demons erupting from sinners' mouths, while The Handmaid's Tale's gilded cages mirror the golden traps of Bosch's hellscapes. Our monsters wear new masks, but the nightmares they represent: loss of control, the collapse of society, the fragility of the body, remain eerily familiar. Medieval artists understood something we often forget. Fear thrives in the abstract. By sculpting their terrors into stone or painting them onto altar pieces, they made the unimaginable tangible. A peasant could point to a fresco of the Last Judgment and say, "There, that's what I'm afraid of." Today, we do the same with climate change infographics or pandemic models, transforming statistics into visceral images of burning forests or overcrowded hospitals. The medium evolves, but the instinct doesn't. Even our memes, those digital memento mori, play with skulls and grim reapers, proving gallows humor is as timeless as the Danse Macabre. Yet there's a crucial difference. Where medieval art often weaponized fear to enforce dogma, modern creators frequently wield it to challenge power. A horror film like Get Out uses grotesque imagery to expose racism, much like how marginal drolleries in manuscripts subtly mocked corrupt clergy. The gargoyles on our screens today aren't just guarding cathedrals, they're interrogating the systems that built them. As this journey through the dark symbolism of medieval art ends, here's a question to sit with. What do our own monstrous creations, from AI dystopias to zombie plagues, say about the fears we can't yet name? Drop your thoughts below, and if this dive into history's shadows left you equal parts unsettled and enlightened, hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more deep dives into the art of the unseen. After all, the past's nightmares still whisper, if you know where